So here's some of the guidelines from the Australian Cattle Vets Guidelines. So initially, what I want to do for each of your manager groups. So we've got your sheet here. We've got all these manager groups. 2009, 2011s, 2012s. I assume these girls are running in individual manager groups by parity, and later on, as they get older, they get combined into adult manager groups to have a larger adult manager group. Like the EFGs are just older cows that get boxed together as they age, but they're run by parity for the early part of their life. Yes.
No, so they're run together until they're pre-tested in calf the second time in theory, and then they'll go back to Cape Portland and they will get potentially boxed up with any other age group from their second pre-testing.
Yeah, in my neck of the woods, and look, I'm not a big fan of it. A lot of folks run cows by parity. And the reason it pisses me off is I'll be out there testing the yellow tags, and there's only 60 of them left, and they're mud fat. And then I'll get into the green tags, and there's 110 of them, and they're skinny. And I say, can't we put some of these in with those yellow tags? And they go, oh, no, you don't want to be mixing up these 8- and 9-year-old cows. For fuck's sake, boys. But so what you're doing has some very good merit management-wise. And what I understand is you're bringing in these pregnant second calvers, and you're topping up the management groups to suit the stocking density that they're able to handle within the areas that they're in, if I've got that correct. The risk of that is each time you bring animals, am I correct in that?
Doing it on timing of pregnancy. So the early calvers will have a couple of mobs of cattle that are early calvers on their first cycle, and then we'll have some other mobs that are calving on their second cycle. So depending on the timing of pregnancy for their second calf, when they're pre-tested for their second calf, will really depend on which subsequent calving group they go into.
Awesome. Okay, cool. So the more I think the best job we do as producers and veterinarians in doing exactly what you're talking about. So in staging pregnancies, in implementing reproductive technologies, in most of those procedures, we often are tweaking management groups. We're making changes to management groups over time where we're topping up, moving out. And essentially what we're doing is we're introducing cows to new cows a lot throughout their life. That has huge production benefits. But from a BVD perspective, it also comes with pretty significant risk. Because each time an animal meets, there's two questions. One question is there a PI in that group? And the other question is this animal immune? So if in your production system, if we can go in and try to identify the at-risk management groups that exist within the existing adult population and then try to mitigate that, and then get this program on the heifers and second calvers sorted out where we are sure that they are both immune and PI-free before we come back and reintroduce them back to the big population, we can start getting you back on track. If you follow me. Because you certainly don't want to sacrifice all the good benefits that you've got. Like, for instance, the example that I gave you of the big wreck that happened in that Angus stud, they boxed those groups for a good reason, to simplify management. And because of rotationally grazing, it allowed them to double their number of paddocks so that they could essentially they could graze harder and rotate, through twice as many cells. And so it was a good thing to do. But what we had to do is we've got to set the system up with our BVD management so that is no longer a risky proposition. Are you with me?
Yeah, just to clarify then, so we draw a line in the sand now, for example. Do we then go and bleed 5% of all the management groups at the Cape right now just to get an idea of where they're at? Or do we just ignore? Okay. And then we look at the heifers and the second calvers two groups.
Definitely. Well, we'll go through these, and then it'll all kind of now, knowing that that's your question. When I talk through this, it'll all kind of fill in that scenario. But I'm an advocate of doing that for a lot of my producers here that run just by parity. When I say parity, they stay together as age groups. For them, I'll say, well, maybe let's just start on your heifers and clean them up because they're by parity. I'm expecting the PIs to die in those older groups as they continue to age, and because they're not boxing them and shifting them and moving them around, there's not a lot of risk in their system. If you follow me, versus in the system that you guys have, that Greg's got and team, there's some risk, and I think it'd be worthwhile to at least assess the level of risk that exists in the adult population. You might find that everything's immune. And if that's the case, then we're aces. And then the next step would be, which I'll talk about in a minute, of seeing if we can maybe track down where PIs may still exist, which I'll show you in a second. And it works really well, these strategies, in finding these adult PIs. So I'll start banging on, and then we'll redress all these questions if I don't address them appropriately at the end of this little bit of these next 10 slides. Cool beans. So initially we want to, and these are the guidelines, and again, they're tools for everyone to take what they need and leave what they don't need. But what we just talked about just then is we want to establish the individual management groups, individual risk and their immune status. So if we can bleed 5% or at least 6 animals from each existing adult manager group, we're essentially asking them, are you highly immune to BVD? And if the answer is, yep, we're highly immune, so if the answer is yes, then we're just going to keep an eye on that group. So I don't normally go charging in, guns ablazing, looking for PIs. And part of that's just the lesson of, hard-learned lessons, where I used to think PIs probably lived a lot longer than I thought. And I didn't realize early on that PIs are so bloody good at immunizing their entire management group that they exist in. So I always thought that it took maybe a few years for the PI to eventually make the entire group immune, and that each generation had a couple PIs. It doesn't seem to work like that. It seems like what it does, it goes wham, and it really hammers a group. It finds everyone that's naive, everyone that's at risk, produces as many PIs as it can, makes that group immune, and then that group's done and dusted, and now has produced offspring that are a threat to the next manager group. So I was over time have come to the conclusion that, look, if they're highly immune, if I go guns ablazing, it was quite common that I would come through, like in that wreck that I told you before, all those existing older manager groups that produced all those naive calves, those mothers were all immune. And if I went ear notching all of them, I'd spend a bunch of money for the producer, and my lab would be going, gee, these testing is great, but we're not getting any PIs to report, and everyone gets really shitty. So we're trying to invest in the best outcome for people. So I tend to monitor them. I'm like, let's keep an eye on them. We're going to come back here, but let's just set them over here. They're highly immune. We know that the cows are not at risk to having a PI introduced to them. There may be a PI in there. Let's just sit them over here on the right. Okay, but if they're not highly immune, then I say, ooh, we better vaccinate these girls. Now, my northern cattle, like talking to Peter Letchford, going, what do we do in the north? We never get a complete muster. So I'll say, well, let's check your heifers prior to mating. And let's say it's 30% immunity. I'd say, well, let's vaccinate. And then let's put them back out. And that next muster, if we have the ability to, let's assess them again. And so see, is that wait 1 year and test the blood samples again. Because the vaccine doesn't kick up the same sort of immunity that natural exposure does. So if let's say we had, say, 40% of a management group that are immune, and then we go, right, let's vaccinate these girls because they're at risk. We could come back a year later and blood test them, and if that's jumped up to like 80% or 90% or 100%, you could say, well, no sense giving them another booster. Let's start monitoring them. But also, we've got some evidence there that there could be some exposure happening in that group. So that's kind of my setting the stage. In the dairy job, we do a lot of bulk milk testing, but in the beef game, it's all about individual management groups. There are like individual herds, like states within a country. Let's look at them, and then let's move on to the next important phase. So that's obviously not the end of the road. It's a beautiful picture, isn't it? Man, I'm moving some units there. Look at all them bloody road trains. My goal is to see every group of Australian replacement heifers screened for immunity to BVD prior to mating for the life of the property. Every group for the life of this property, and the life of this property here, and the life moving forward. All right, so what do we do on the heifers? Well, it's key that when we blood test these heifers, we've got to do a couple of things we've got to make sure of. We have to make sure they're at least 8 months old. And the reason being is they've got maternal antibodies up till about 6, and that maternal antibody will interfere with them actually getting sick and mounting their own immune response because they rely on their mother's immunity. So we want them to be at least 8 months old, and they need to have been living together for at least 2 months. So if there's a PI there, it has the opportunity to get a meaningful immune response from that animal. So then we ask ourselves, are over half of you immune to BVD? And if the answer is no, out of this group of replacement heifers, and that's really good evidence, unless it's like an exceptionally low stocking density, very spread out with manager groups that don't like to communicate with one another. If it's less than 50%, I'm pretty bloody certain that there's no PI in there. And the thing about all these guidelines is, like, a lot of the diagnostic testing we do as veterinarians is no plan is 100% foolproof, but in my experience, these animals, if they're less than 50%, there's not going to be a PI in there. So I would say let's vaccinate them. And then if you go down there to the bottom, the goal is that they're highly immune and PI free. Now, if it's more than 50%, then the next question is it over 80? And if it's over 80, and normally it's 100, if it's over 80, then they're pretty highly bloody immune. So I'm not going to worry about vaccinating. I'm going to go, yes, down here. I'm going to PI screen them. I'm going to ear notch them. If I find any PIs, I'm going to get rid of them. And again, the goal, highly immune and PI free. Okay. Now, if it's between 50 and 80, that's kind of this no man's land again, where I'm going, that's weird. Why is that? So there's three reasons why they could be between 50 and 80. One, it could be that the animals that you bled that were negative could actually be PIs if you happen to step into a real wreck. And normally producers know that shit's not fucking right when you got a lot of PIs in your replacement heifers, because there's a lot of history of bad outcomes and the heifers just don't look right. So that might come in part of the history. And as the diagnostician veterinarian telling me what to do in my lab, because we do the blood testing and the ear notching, you would say, ooh, let's look into these. So we would screen those antibody negatives. Now, if we find a PI in those antibody negatives, then we know that the mob is going to have been exposed to a PI, obviously, because we found one, and there could be more. So then we would PI screen the rest of the entire group, and they would be highly immune and PI free. Now, that's a very rare outcome, because normally you're only going to find 1 out of 6, and so they're going to be 83%. So you're going to be screening anyway. Okay, so that's one of the 3 things that could happen. The other 2 things is that they got exposed before they got grouped as a group. And so some of the mobs out there on the other property, they met a PI when they were calves, then they got weaned, they got transported. The PI was left behind because it was a steer or it was a cull heifer. And so they arrived there, and now they're a stable group with a reasonable amount of immunity. And there's no ongoing seroconversion, or the immunity isn't growing, or if that makes sense, because it's stable. And that's a reasonably common thing. And in that example I made before, when I looked at all those naive heifers that produce, the 50 abortions, 50 dead calves, and 120 PIs, that's what I was trying to ascertain. Did some of those girls that were from some management groups not have a bad outcome at all? And that would have suggested that they were immune before they got there. Turns out they were 100% naive. That group of 335 heifers, there wasn't a single immune girl in that group. Irrespective of which management group they came from, they had the same bad outcome of 50, which is 15% abortions, 15% dead calves, and 33% PIs. 120 out of 335, yeah. Regardless of where they came from. So that's quite a common scenario, is that they got exposed while they were on their mothers, or maybe when they all got brought in together, when they got yarded before the steers got pulled off, which might only be a day or 2. The third option is that there's ongoing seroconversion. So that could mean that there's either a PI in there that hasn't gotten around to see everybody, or you've got exposure from outside of the mob. So how can we tell these ones apart? Well, we ran an antigen test on the negatives, so we ruled that one out as to whether or not any of them are PIs. That's right up here. It was a PI identified group. So now we just got, is there ongoing exposure or not? And that's pretty easy to solve as well. We just wait a month and we re-blood test the girls that were negative before. Now, if they stay negative, then there's not ongoing seroconversion. If they become positive, then there's ongoing exposure. And that can either be within the mob or from outside if you got really bad biosecurity. So if you get ongoing exposure, then we need to make sure there's no PIs. So then we would ear notch the group. And the goal would be highly immune and PI free. That makes sense? So that's the heifer thing. Now, that looks really convoluted, but for the most part, it goes like this. Are your heifers immune? Yes, ear notch. Are your heifers immune? No, vaccinate. 90% of the time, that's the case. There's not much in that middle ground, but every now and again, you got a little bit more diagnostics. So again, if we really drill down on it, it's normally this, either vaccinate or ear notch. So here's some samples coming into our lab, BVD. So looking at 1,200 groups of blood samples from vets across Australia. So we receive, and as people send BVD diagnostics to a DPI, they're usually sending them to us. And so this is like less than 50% are the blues, greater than 80% are the grays, and in between's those oranges. Those we've got to do more diagnostic testing. So normally they're either mostly all antibody negative or all antibody positive. See where they normally sit? See how there's a hollow in the middle? So if you looked at it on a pie chart, 34% of the time we said, let's ear notch all the heifers. 54% of the time we said, cool, let's vaccinate all the heifers. Now the reason this is a larger number is we got a lot of dairies, especially, and a fair few beef herds that have been doing BVD control for a while now, and so now their heifers come through antibody negative every year. So the reason why we're getting more groups becoming more and more naive over time is not because generally across Australia it's 54% of heifers are naive, but the people that have taken on board what we are preaching and taking on the management advice that I'm providing, they're having success. I've got guys that have been going 7 or 8 years now of antibody negative heifers, and they're just vaccinating them. Those guys will sometimes corner me and say, when can I stop vaccinating? And I say, well, the vaccine's 80% effective. Your heifers have been naive for, say, 7 years. That tells me that you haven't produced a PI. And we know the vaccine's not 100%. So that tells me that your biosecurity must be pretty bloody good. So my question to you is, do you want more flexibility going forward, the ability to buy in animals of unknown status? Or are you going to stay self-replacing and you feel pretty confident that your biosecurity is pretty bloody good? Because we have evidence to that effect. They're like, well, I kind of don't want to be self-replacing. I say, well, if you'd like, maybe stop vaccinating those girls that are over 5 years old. And then maybe the next year cut it back to 4 years old. And then maybe after that cut it back to 3. Maybe eventually just do your heifers. But keep checking your heifers. And if all of a sudden, bang, we get a bunch of freaking immune heifers, go, well, it's not a wreck. Nothing got turned into a PI other than some calves. Let's start revacing some groups. Let's make sure none of these heifers are PIs. Let's put the genie back in the bottle. We're cool because we know that there's no PIs in the system that are adults. You follow me? So and that's one of the complaints people have about this. Like, oh, you must work for Pfizer and you want us to all vaccinate until we're dead. I say, well, I don't. What I want to do is clean you up, and then I want you to help your neighbor clean up so that both of you can eventually not have to vaccinate. But in the front end, yes, the vaccine's a very effective tool. So in that scenario of those 1,300 samples that came into my lab, 12% required that little bit of dicking around of rebleeding some negatives. And that's assuming that the samples we got were cohort serologies, because sometimes people bleed animals for other reasons. And I'm just taking all the samples that come in our door. We run an analysis across them. Again, the 4 basic reasons why you get partial antibody response: either the heifers without immunity to BVD are actually PIs, it's historic exposure, or you've got ongoing exposure. And with those tools that I said, we can rule those 3 out very easily. Like here's an example. Craig Wood helped me pull this together. So we've got 3 farms, 3 dairies with 3 different farms raising their 3 different heifers. So here's this group here, Uno farm. They're 4 negatives, 1 positive. This next group, we got 4 positives, 2 negatives. In the last group, there's 4 positives, 1 negative. So that group, 17% seropositive, let's vaccinate. This group, 83% seropositive, let's ear notch them. This group, it's in the middle, 67%. So what we do is we go back, we're going to do some investigation, we're going to rebleed some animals. Here they are. They're negative still. We rebleed a handful more. We work out with our combined results from both the first set of sampling and the second set of sampling. It turns out it's 6 out of 12, but it's stable. There's no ongoing seroconversion. It's 50%. My advice, vaccinate. Because it's not over 80%. 80% is kind of my cutoff because, that's what the vaccine would do. Natural exposure is that level. I feel pretty good about it. Hindsight is always 20/20. So again, if we were to go back to these folks and look at these girls the year before the wreck, I would have said, Tom, what you need to do, we need to ear notch. And I looked this year and I said, woo, I reckon I'd be vaccinating. And I certainly wouldn't have been boxing them with these girls. Hindsight is always 20/20. We really could have saved them some coin. So is that the end of the road? Well, again, my goal is every group of heifers. And it's not a big expense. If Colleen comes out or one of the other good kids and you just bleed, 5% or a minimum of 6 of your replacement heifers every year. I've got those Tigos for people that live out in the middle of nowhere. We're just keeping our ear to the ground because information provides flexibility, and flexibility drives profitability. Because each one of those blood tests, man, it's like a report card. Like if they come through antibody negative, we are doing well. Okay, so what if we're blood testing our heifers and they're all antibody positive? And so we ear notch, we find a PI and we get rid of it. And the next year, we blood test our heifers and they're all antibody positive. We go, so we ear notch and we find a PI. So we get rid of it. And the next year, they're all antibody positive. And the next year, they're all antibody positive. What the hell's going on? Well, what's going on is either your biosecurity is poor or there's an adult PI that has not fallen out of the system. Like that 12-year-old girl that won the ECA. They are out there. They're not very common, but they are out there to some extent. So this is how I found this girl. This lady here, that you're looking at in front of you, this is her 3rd calf at foot. That calf's a PI. So were her previous 2 calves. So what does that tell you? She's a PI. PIs will, and a non-PI animal in its lifetime will only produce 1 PI most of the time. There's occasional animals that get exposed when they're young and then years later with no ongoing exposure for an anamnestic response become susceptible to produce a second PI, but that's very rare. Great, white coat classes, that sort of stuff. But in the real world, it doesn't happen very often. This animal produced, the previous 2 weaners got to about a year of age, right when the guy was getting ready to sell them, and then they wasted away and died. The guy said, I've got, the wiener for this one was still alive at the time, and it was wasting away. And the guy rang me and said, man, this freaking wiener looks like a piece of shit. And said, the previous calf did the same. And I said, well, take an ear notch from it. He did. It was positive. I said, see if you can find the mom. He said, oh, I found her. She's got a calf. I said, test them both for me, would you? And sure enough, they're both PIs. So a non-systematic strategy to find these adult PIs in your herd is whenever you find a poor doing calf marking, you got something that's come across, let's say you're using a cradle, you go, oh, geez, this one must be a twin. Spray paint a number on that thing, or put an extra tag in its ear that's extra bright, like maybe it's a big old pink flap tag with a number 1 on it and a number 2. Test, you're marking, say, 2,000 calves. You end up got 5 calves that you spray paint or put a big bright tag on, and then send those ear notches in. Take them into Colleen. She can run a point of care or send them to us. And if one of those is a PI, or Colleen can give it to you and you can run them right there while you're doing the job, even on the point of cares. If you find a PI there, then go back out in the paddock and find that little bugger. And sure enough, he'll be there nursing off a cow, and then write down her ID. And you don't need to panic because the damage is already done unless you're getting ready to mix groups together. Write down that animal's number, and the next time you got it in the yards, take an ear notch from it. And if she's a PI, sell her. Get rid of her. So that's a non-systematic strategy. It's not sensitive, but it's bloody specific if you do find her to be a PI. So find a crappy-looking animal. Is it a PI? If it's no, just keep an eye on it. No worries. There's lots of reasons to look like dog shit. If it is a PI, identify and screen the mother. If the mother's a PI, then call her and the calf. If she's not a PI, just call the calf down the track if it is a PI, because you don't want it in your production system. There's not much value in trying to grow them out. So in Hessman's study, he had those 86 PIs. Half of them made it to the kill floor with the rest of their herd, with the rest of their management group. The other half, a quarter of them died, and a quarter of them got realized, meaning they got sent to be made into dog tucker, because as soon as they started wasting away, they'd usually out them if they could, find a different pathway for. So this works really cool. I've been doing this for some guys, and I really like this. It works well. So again, you get immune heifers. You're like, this is pissing me off, Colleen. We're trying to get rid of this thing, and we're still getting immune heifers. You're like, well, I reckon what we got, Greg, is we must have an adult PI somewhere in the system. How are we going to find it? Well, this works pretty cool. So fence line weaning works really well. We do it in the U.S. a bit. I'm a big fan of yard weaning as well. But fence line weaning is pretty bloody handy if you've got a rotational grazing setup. You put your cows on one side, you put the calves on the other. They can see each other. The calves tend to graze as they do. As you can see here, they've grazed along this fence where they've been walking along. Cows are doing the same. And eventually what they do is they start to drift off, like those ladies over on the hill. Eventually they go, bugger it. I'm not going to sit here and eat this crappy stepped on shit on feed. I'm going to go wander up over here. And by then the calf, he's off doing his own thing. And it's a pretty low stress way to wean. But it's a great photo, because what I'm talking about doing here is what we can do at weaning is before you commingle these calves, and this is key. If you commingle them, you blind yourself from the information. But let's say number 146 there, the girl in the foreground, let's say she's a PI. Well, if she's a PI, she's been living with all these calves. She also probably has a calf who's a PI that's been living with all these calves. So let's go and say that fellow right behind that blue mix tank. Let's say we ear notch. What we do is at weaning, we blood test a handful of these calves, these calves at weaning. So we go in and we bleed these 4 or 5 here on the left. If they're all antibody negative, then they have not lived with a PI. That means none of these calves are PIs and none of these mothers are PIs. So we've ruled them out. They can be ticked off the list. Every animal in that manager group is not a PI. If we blood test these calves at weaning and they're all immune, then we go, wow, shit, how did that happen? Well, there's only one way it could have happened, and that's from meeting a PI. So that tells us that either one of these calves is a PI, or one of these cows in this production system is a PI, or both. And so that's how we can find these adult PIs. So you can rule out the groups. Like you've given me your 10 groups. We might go through and find, when we check them at weaning, that we've only got one group that's got immune calves. And we say, well, these calves have been raised with a PI. That's pretty cool. So we know those other groups. We don't even have to go hunting. We don't have to look for an adult PI in those groups. We find that adult PI, we send her off to the meat truck with extreme prejudice, and then the next year when we blood test our heifers, they all come through antibody negative. Hey, winning. Pretty cool, eh? You know, it's a bloody great disease in that it's just so easy to kick its ass. So yeah, that's how we do. Blood test a handful of calves at weaning. Preferably, I'd like the calves to be about 6 months of age. I'm a fan of early weaning. I mean, we can try it at 150 kilo, 200 kilo calves, but preferably I can be around that 250 kilos, you know, at 6 months of age. We ask them, are they immune? If the answer is yes, then we go ahead and screen the cows in that group, find the PI, and get her killed. If they're naive, then we just continue to monitor that group. There's no PI in that group. Pretty cool, eh? Lastly, biosecurity. If you are introducing animals to your herd, and most people at one stage or other do, you need to know the status of that animal. So, and you can test it, but the biggest risk is to bring in an animal that's preg tested in calf to a PI. So, do you know the PI status of the animal to be introduced? If the answer is no, screen it. Is the animal PI? Yes, kill it. Is it not a PI? Is it pregnant? If the answer is no, cool, introduce it to the herd. Is it pregnant? And the answer is yes, but it's not a PI. Then you can introduce it to the herd, but you need to calve it down separately. Screen that calf when it's born. If the calf's a PI, kill it. If it's not, introduce it to the herd. If you bring in a big group of cows that are preg tested in calf, you know you've got a good bonds or feed situation, you bought another property, you've got a line on a nice group of girls, just don't mix them together until they calve. Let them calve, maybe let them get up to weaning, screen some of those calves at weaning for antibodies. If they're all naive, sweet, that management group can go and join the rest of the group. If those calves are all antibody positive at weaning, then you need to ear notch everything, calves and cows. Get rid of the PIs, and then you can introduce it to the herd. But yeah, it's a big risk buying and trading animals. So that's why I really try to get all my guys to raise their own replacements. Because guys that buy in preg tested in calf heifers, they are eventually going to get their ass handed to them with BVD. Eventually, every time. We had a guy here in Esperance bought 2 lots of heifers from 2 different locations, AI'd them, and then sold what didn't take to AI. And then he was a bit of a stalker. He did it as a bit of a punt to try to make some money selling preg tested in heifers. And he had some, because he was a trader, he had some stalkers that had kind of didn't make the truck. He was doing grassies. And sure enough, there was a couple out there that were struggling. You can guess why. And anyway, chucked these pregnant heifers out there after we AI'd them, and half the calves were PIs out of them. And he's pretty shitty about it. So you just gotta think about these things. And it's not hard once you understand how this disease works. And we got the tools to mitigate these risks. So let's use them, folks. Biosecurity, it's key, Don't be eating bats.